Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories to help you sleep tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like, comment, or subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. Emma first noticed the figure at the edge of her yard on a quiet Tuesday evening. It stood just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight, in the shadow where the light couldn't quite stretch. From the moment she spotted it, something about its stillness unnerved her. It wasn't the presence of a person that disturbed her, but the way it stayed there, unmoving, as if it had no intention of leaving. She told herself it was nothing, maybe just a misinterpretation of the dark shapes cast by the trees or a trick of her tired eyes. As the minutes passed, she convinced herself that it must have been something innocent, perhaps a misplaced object or even a neighbor out for a walk. But when she looked again later that night, the figure was still there, standing in the same spot. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she caught sight of it again, closer this time. It now stood just outside the perimeter of her yard, its outline sharper against the night. The figure's stillness unnerved her even more than before. Emma shut her curtains with a quick pull, determined to block it out and get on with her night. She locked her doors, double-checked the windows, and tried to focus on the steady hum of the television. But every so often, she found herself glancing toward the window, her pulse quickening. Her thoughts kept circling back to that shadow, as if it were lingering just outside her mind as much as her home. That night, sleep evaded her. Her mind buzzed with irrational thoughts, and her ears seemed to pick up the faintest creak, every shift in the wind outside. Finally, unable to resist, she approached the window once more. She pushed the curtain back a fraction of an inch and peered out. Her heart sank. The figure was no longer at the edge of her yard. It was on her front porch. Panic bubbled in her chest, and her first instinct was to grab her phone. She dialed the police, her fingers trembling as she relayed the situation. When they arrived, they found nothing. No one on the porch, no signs of any disturbance. They told her it was likely someone passing by and reassured her before leaving. But that didn't sit right with Emma. She had seen it, standing right there. The following day, Emma did her best to carry on as usual, trying not to let the previous nights linger in her thoughts. But as dusk approached, a growing sense of dread settled over her. By now, she was familiar with the routine. The figure would be waiting. But tonight, when she glanced through the window, there was nothing. The porch was empty. Relief surged through her, though it felt fleeting. She knew better than to let her guard down. Hours later, as she prepared for bed, a strange unease crept over her once more. She had avoided the windows all evening, trying to put the figure out of her mind, but something compelled her to look one last time. With trembling hands, she drew the curtains back again, expecting the worst. But once again, nothing. The night was still. Emma exhaled deeply, allowing herself to feel the first sense of calm she had experienced in days. She turned from the window, her feet carrying her back toward the hallway. Then she froze. There, in the dim light spilling from the kitchen, was a dark outline standing in her living room. Ethan had always been fascinated by the stories of the old railways, especially the abandoned lines that crisscrossed the remote countryside. One in particular intrigued him, an old forgotten track running through a forest, long out of service. It was said that a signalman once stood watch there, controlling the flow of trains that no longer came. According to local legend, the signalman had vanished without a trace many years ago, and the track was officially closed shortly afterward. Yet, there were rumors that his signal lantern could still be seen at night, swinging in the distance. Curiosity got the better of Ethan, and on a chilly autumn evening, he ventured out to find the old track. After walking through dense woods for over an hour, he finally came upon the remnants of the railway, partially buried under fallen leaves and overgrown vines. The rails gleamed faintly under the twilight sky, despite their years of disuse, as if they had been waiting for something or someone. Ethan followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches intertwined above him, casting long shadows on the path. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. There were no birds, no rustling of animals, only the soft crunch of leaves underfoot as Ethan continued along the forgotten railway. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance just beyond the next bend. It swayed gently from side to side, casting an odd glow across the rails. Ethan's pulse quickened. The light could only be the signalman's lantern, just as the stories had said. Intrigued, he quickened his pace, eager to get a closer look. The light remained ahead, always just out of reach, as if leading him further down the track. As the night settled fully over the forest, the lantern grew brighter, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan could no longer see the way he had come. The darkness had swallowed the forest behind him, leaving him with only the lantern's glow as a guide. The trees seemed to press in closer, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching toward the tracks. He felt a shift in the atmosphere as the light flickered, then steadied again. The ground beneath the tracks seemed to tremble slightly, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough to make him pause. It was then that Ethan realized something strange. He could hear the faint sound of a train's whistle in the distance. He hadn't expected this. There hadn't been trains on this line for decades. Yet the unmistakable wail of the whistle echoed through the trees, low and mournful. Confusion turned to unease as the light ahead began to swing more vigorously. The signalman's lantern seemed to grow agitated, as if warning of something approaching. Ethan's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the sudden change. The rails beneath his feet began to hum softly, vibrating with a subtle energy. The whistle sounded again, this time louder, closer. A gust of wind swept through the trees, causing the branches to creak and sway. Ethan felt a deep vibration underfoot, the unmistakable sensation of an oncoming train. The realization sent a chill through his bones. There hadn't been a train on this track in years, yet now it was coming, and fast. The distant whistle was no longer a faint echo. It was a piercing shriek cutting through the stillness of the forest. The tracks trembled violently now, the vibrations growing stronger with every passing second. In the distance, a dark shape emerged from the forest gloom, a massive, hulking silhouette barreling down the tracks. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. An old steam engine, its iron frame gleaming ominously in the dim light. Its headlamp cut through the darkness like a blinding eye, illuminating the path ahead. Thick black smoke billowed from its chimney, swirling in the night air, and the sound of grinding metal filled the space around him. The train was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its ancient, rusted body looked as though it had been pulled straight from another era, yet it moved with terrifying speed and power. The whistle screeched again, louder and more frantic, as the train barreled toward him. Panic surged through Ethan. He turned to run, but the forest now felt like a cage. The once familiar path was gone, swallowed by darkness. His only option was to keep running along the tracks, but the train was approaching too fast. He sprinted, his feet pounding against the wooden ties, but the train's roar was deafening, closing the distance with unnatural speed. Glancing over his shoulder, Ethan's heart sank. The train was nearly upon him. Its massive wheels clattered on the rails with a deafening noise, and the ground beneath him seemed to quake with each turn of the wheels. He was out of time, out of options. The signalman's lantern swung violently now, as if desperately trying to warn him, but it was too late. The train was unstoppable. But just as Ethan prepared for the inevitable impact, something strange happened. The train passed through him, not with the force of solid metal, but as though it were made of mist. Its form dissolved around him, its iron bulk turning into a cold, chilling vapor that enveloped his body. For a brief moment, Ethan was plunged into an icy fog, unable to see or move. The sound of the train roared in his ears, yet it did not strike him. Instead, it flowed through him, leaving only a deep, gnawing cold in its wake. As the fog lifted, Ethan stood trembling on the tracks. The train had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The lantern in the distance stopped swinging and dimmed, its glow fading into the night. The vibrations underfoot ceased, and the forest returned to its oppressive silence. Shaken, Ethan stumbled forward, his mind reeling from what had just occurred. The stories of the signalman's warning weren't just tales meant to frighten. They were true. The train that haunted this stretch of track wasn't a memory of the past. It was a ghost, forever bound to the rails, running its course through time. The forest around him felt different now, as if it had witnessed something ancient and terrible. The track itself seemed older, the metal rails gleaming faintly in the dark, as though they had never been abandoned. Ethan realized then that the train was not just a phantom of the old railway. It was a harbinger, a warning that the boundaries between the living and the dead were not as firm as he had once believed. And the signalman's lantern, forever swinging in the night, was the only thing that stood between those who wandered too far and the ghostly train that would claim them. Sarah always hated the old mirror in her grandmother's hallway. It had been there for as long as she could remember, a massive antique thing with intricate carvings that twisted and curled along its frame like creeping vines. The surface of the glass, while smooth and polished, seemed unnaturally dark, absorbing the light in an unsettling way. After her grandmother passed, Sarah inherited the house, along with all the belongings inside, including the mirror. She thought about getting rid of it many times, but something about it held her back. Maybe sentimentality, maybe something else. The mirror hung in her bedroom now, a decision she regretted almost immediately. From her bed, she could see it at night, standing tall against the wall, its dark frame like an ominous figure watching over her. Sometimes, when she walked past it during the day, she would feel an odd pull, as though something inside was waiting for her to notice it, to pay closer attention. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, something felt off. At certain angles, her eyes seemed a little too dark, her expression not quite her own. It was the kind of fleeting feeling that left her questioning whether she'd actually seen anything at all. But as the days passed, the strange sensations grew harder to ignore. Her reflection lingered in her mind long after she walked away from the mirror, like a haunting memory that wasn't supposed to be there. One evening, as she moved about her room, she glanced at the mirror and noticed something that made her pause. Her reflection was slower than usual, a split second behind her actual movements. She blinked, and the reflection followed, just a beat too late. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to look away, shaking off the unease. She told herself it was a trick of the light, that her mind was playing games with her. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Days turned into nights, and her relationship with the mirror became stranger. Every time she looked into it, she felt a growing sense of discomfort, as though her reflection was somehow separate from her. One night, as she prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Her reflection moved on its own. It was slight at first, a tilt of the head that didn't match her own movement. She stared, frozen in place, watching as the image in the glass slowly distorted. Her reflection's lips curled upward, forming a smile that was nothing like the one she wore on her face. The grin stretched wider, an expression too exaggerated to be her own, almost mocking her. The eyes in the mirror darkened, glinting with something she couldn't quite place, something that didn't belong to her. The longer she stared, the more it felt like she wasn't looking into a reflection at all, but into something else, something that had been hiding just beneath the surface all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Unable to tear her eyes away, Sarah watched in horror as her reflection pressed its hands against the glass. She could see the outline of her own fingers, yet the sensation didn't match. She wasn't moving, but her reflection was. The figure inside the mirror leaned forward, the glass rippling slightly, as if it were more liquid than solid. Her reflection's face loomed closer, impossibly close, until it seemed to be staring directly out of the mirror at her, its eyes filled with a dark hunger. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, but the image in the mirror didn't retreat. Instead, it began to step forward, pushing through the glass as if the boundary between the mirror and the room no longer existed. The figure that had once been her reflection now moved independently, its movements fluid and unnatural. It was no longer a mere image in the mirror. It was something else entirely, something that had crossed over from wherever it had been waiting. As it stepped fully into the room, Sarah realized with dawning horror that the thing wearing her face was no longer confined to the mirror. It had crossed over into her world, and it was no longer content with just watching her from the other side. Sophie hurried onto the platform, relieved to catch the last train of the night. The station was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual bustling crowds. She had been lucky to grab the final ticket before the booth closed. The train itself, a relic from another time, stood waiting as if it had materialized from the past. Its exterior was weathered, the metal rusted in patches, and the windows fogged with age. She boarded quickly, noting the odd stillness inside. The carriage was dimly lit, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The seats, upholstered in cracked leather, looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. A few passengers sat scattered throughout, their faces partially obscured by heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats. They didn't glance up as Sophie passed by, their gazes fixed on nothing in particular. Sophie found a seat by the window, setting her bag down and trying to relax. The train jolted forward, lurching into motion with an unsettling groan of metal against metal. Outside, the landscape blurred as the train left the station and entered the dark countryside. Trees passed by like twisted silhouettes, barely visible in the dim light. Minutes stretched into hours, and Sophie found herself growing more uneasy. The ride was unusually smooth, too smooth, and the rhythm of the train's motion felt almost hypnotic. She glanced around, realizing that none of the other passengers had moved. Their postures remained rigid, their heads slightly bowed, as if they were frozen in time. The train seemed to glide through the darkness with an unnatural grace, the world outside nothing more than an empty void. As the train sped through the night, a gnawing sense of wrongness settled over Sophie. The journey felt endless, as if they were no longer bound by the physical tracks of the railway. She checked her phone, but there was no service, not even a trace of a signal. It was as though they had slipped into a place outside the reach of the modern world. The landscape outside grew stranger with each passing moment. The trees were no longer recognizable forms. They had become twisted and deformed, their branches curling unnaturally against the black sky. Shadows danced in the distance, fleeting figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The moon, once visible, had disappeared entirely, leaving only a blanket of darkness stretching in all directions. Then, without warning, the train began to slow. Sophie's stomach knotted as she peered out of the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of a station or a signpost. But there was nothing, no platform, no lights, no buildings. The train came to a stop in the middle of nowhere, the landscape outside an endless sea of shadow. The passengers remained motionless, as if unaware that the train had halted. Sophie's unease grew as a figure approached from the far end of the carriage. The conductor, tall and gaunt, moved with deliberate steps down the aisle. His uniform was faded, the fabric frayed at the edges. His face, half hidden in the dim light, was expressionless, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his cap. He moved from passenger to passenger, checking their tickets with a slow, methodical precision. When he reached Sophie, a chill ran through her. His hand extended toward her, but as he examined her ticket, his demeanor changed. His gaze lingered on the piece of paper, his movements pausing ever so slightly. He looked at Sophie with a strange intensity, as if he had discovered something that didn't belong. The conductor turned abruptly and disappeared back down the aisle, his footsteps fading into the distance. The train began to move again, but the atmosphere had shifted. Sophie's pulse quickened as she glanced around, her eyes darting to the other passengers. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, they began to stir. Their movements were slow and disjointed, their heads lifting from their previous slumped positions. Their faces, now more visible in the shifting light, were pale and drawn, as if drained of life. Eyes that had once been dull and lifeless now gleamed with an eerie glow. One by one, the passengers turned their heads towards Sophie, their expressions empty yet somehow filled with a quiet, unnerving hunger. As the train sped onward into the abyss, Sophie felt the walls of the carriage close in. The passage of time had become irrelevant. There were no stops, no familiar stations, only the endless forward motion of the train, hurtling through a world that no longer seemed to follow the rules of the living. The other passengers, now fully alert, began to shift in their seats, their movements stiff and unnatural. It dawned on her then, with horrifying clarity, that the train was not merely a vehicle for travelers. It was a vessel for souls, a purgatory that transported the dead to a place beyond the realm of the living. The passengers were not people on a journey home. They were spirits, trapped in an eternal cycle, their destination unknown. And Sophie, who had mistakenly taken the last ticket, was now part of this grim procession. The landscape outside the window had shifted once more. The void of darkness now rippled with strange, indistinct shapes, as if the train were passing through a space between worlds. The figures outside grew clearer, spectral forms that reached toward the train with elongated arms, their faces twisted in agony. They were passengers who had boarded long ago, lost in the endless journey, doomed to wander forever. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the realization set in. The ticket in her hand had sealed her fate. She wasn't meant to be on this train. It was not her journey to take, but now it was too late. The passengers, the conductor, the very train itself, they were all part of something far darker than she could have ever imagined. There would be no getting off at the next station, no return to the world she had once known. The train was her new home, and the final destination was not a place she could ever escape. James had moved into the apartment with high hopes. It was small but cozy and offered him the sense of independence he'd been craving. The first few nights were uneventful, spent unpacking boxes and settling into his new routine. But as he lay in bed one night, he began to notice faint noises coming from the walls. At first it was easy to dismiss, a distant hum or perhaps the sound of old pipes groaning. The building was old, after all. But as the days went by, the noises became more distinct, and they no longer sounded like the harmless creaks of an aging structure. The sounds grew into soft whispers, barely perceptible at first, like the wind brushing against the walls. They were so faint that James would strain to hear them, convincing himself it was his imagination playing tricks. But night after night, the whispers continued, growing a little louder each time, though never loud enough to understand. They seemed to come from different parts of the apartment, sometimes from the bedroom walls, sometimes the living room, always just beyond his reach. It was unsettling, but James told himself it had to be a strange quirk of the building. Perhaps there were pipes in the walls that carried sounds from the other apartments, or maybe thin walls allowed him to hear the neighbors talking late at night, but the whispers followed him. Wherever he was in the apartment, they would eventually start, as if aware of his presence. Sometimes they seemed closer, just behind him, though when he turned to listen more carefully, they would retreat, slipping back into the faint murmur that kept him awake long into the night. It wasn't long before James noticed something even more disturbing. The whispers seemed to respond to him. Whenever he moved around the apartment, they grew louder or quieter, almost as if they were aware of his movements, tracking him through the walls. There were moments when he felt certain that if he could just listen closely enough, he would make out what they were saying. But every time he tried to concentrate, the voices would fade, leaving him with nothing but his own anxious thoughts. The unease began to weigh on him, and the once cozy apartment started to feel oppressive. He found himself walking the length of the walls, pressing his ear to the cold plaster, searching for the source of the sounds. His nights became sleepless, his mind filled with the constant presence of the whispers. They began to sound almost familiar, as if voices he should know, though he couldn't place them. It was as if the walls were alive, their whispers carrying secrets that he was never meant to hear. One night, as he lay in bed, the whispers became louder than ever before, almost insistent. They seemed to call his name, though not in any way he could understand. There was a frantic quality to the sound, as though the voices were trying to warn him, pleading with him to listen. Something was wrong. The walls felt too close, as if they were closing in on him, and the apartment, once his refuge, had become something sinister. Desperation set in. Unable to ignore the whispers any longer, James grabbed a knife from the kitchen and began tearing at the wallpaper in the bedroom. He clawed at the walls, pulling away the old faded paper with frantic energy, determined to find what was hidden behind it. Piece by piece, the wallpaper fell to the floor, revealing the bare plaster underneath. And then he saw it. Carved into the walls, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, were hundreds of faces. They were etched into the plaster, their features contorted in expressions of fear and agony. Tiny mouths, open in silent screams, covered every inch of the surface, their eyes staring out into the room. The faces were impossibly detailed, as though each one had been painstakingly carved by hand. They seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light, as though they were trapped within the wall, pressing forward in their desperation to escape. James backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The whispers grew louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of soft, desperate voices. They no longer seemed like mere sounds. They were coming from the faces in the walls, their mouths moving in unison, calling to him, begging for release. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift around him. The walls pulsed, and for a brief moment it felt as though they were alive, filled with something that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. James stumbled back, his mind spinning with panic. The apartment, once a place of comfort, had transformed into something entirely different. The whispers were no longer the distant, unsettling sounds they had been before. They were something much worse, something that had always been there, hiding just out of sight. Before he could react, a cold pressure spread across the room. The voices swelled into a collective cry, the faces pressing outward from the walls, their tiny mouths twisting open wider, as if they were trying to consume the room itself. James could feel the pull of the voices, drawing him in, their cries filling his mind. He couldn't escape. The apartment had become something much darker, a place where the whispers in the walls were not just sounds, but the remnants of those who had been trapped within them. The last thing James heard before the whispers finally fell silent was a voice, faint but clear, coming from right behind him. A single breath, as though someone was standing in the room with him, waiting for him to join them. And then, everything went quiet. Mark was accustomed to his daily routine of commuting on the 7:30 p.m. train. It was a small, unremarkable line that snaked through the city's industrial zones before reaching his stop. This evening, however, felt different from the outset. The train, normally bustling with commuters, was unusually sparse. The few passengers present seemed preoccupied, their expressions distant and vacant. As the train departed from the station, Mark noticed that something was amiss. The city lights began to fade, but instead of the familiar landscape of factories and apartment buildings, the surroundings outside the window grew obscured by an unnatural darkness. The train's motion was smooth, almost too smooth, and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks had a hollow quality, lacking its usual reassuring cadence. Mark checked his watch. An hour had passed, but the train continued its journey through a dim and featureless landscape. The usual stops, marked by brief halts and the squeal of brakes, were absent. He looked around at the other passengers, who remained eerily still. Their eyes were fixed forward, their bodies rigid and unmoving. An unsettling silence filled the carriage, broken only by the occasional murmur of the train's engine. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Mark stood up and moved toward the conductor's car. The journey felt interminable, and the train's interior seemed to stretch endlessly. The flickering lights overhead cast shifting shadows, adding to the growing sense of disorientation. When he reached the conductor's car, he found it empty, the space seemingly frozen in time. The control panel was dark, and the room was cluttered with forgotten items, a stack of old paperwork, a tarnished whistle. He ventured further, moving through each carriage with growing trepidation. Each compartment he entered was identical to the last. Dull, worn seats, dim lights, and the same vacant expressions on the faces of the few passengers scattered throughout. It was as if the train had become a loop, an endless sequence of identical spaces. Halfway through the journey, the train's lights flickered violently, and the engine's hum shifted to an eerie, dissonant tone. Mark's reflection in the window morphed, shifting from his familiar self to a decayed and spectral version. His heart raced as he realized the reflection wasn't an illusion, but a glimpse of his true self. The train had not been moving through space in the conventional sense. It was traveling through a realm where time and reality were twisted. Mark's realization grew more profound as he saw that the other passengers were not just passengers. They were spectral figures trapped in the same loop. Their eyes, once lifeless, now glowed with an unsettling intensity. The train was no longer bound by the physical constraints of the city or its surroundings. Instead, it was trapped in a perpetual motion, a passage that crossed boundaries between the living and the dead. Panic surged through Mark as he attempted to flee. He ran from carriage to carriage, but each one seemed to be a mirror of the last. The train itself had become a labyrinth, an endless expanse with no clear path to escape. The outside world had been reduced to a swirling void of darkness and fog, an expanse with no discernible end. The train's motion continued unabated, its path unchanging. The once familiar clatter of the wheels became a relentless, oppressive sound. Mark realized that the train was not merely a mode of transport. It was a vessel bound for an unknown destination, one that had long since transcended the ordinary constraints of time and space. The journey was not about reaching a destination, but about enduring an endless passage. As Mark's efforts to escape grew more desperate, the true horror of the situation became evident. The train was a prison, an eternal ride for those who had missed their chance to depart. The passengers around him, the spectral figures, were part of this unending cycle, forever bound to the train's journey through an unknowable realm. The realization was inescapable. Mark was not just a passenger. He was now part of the endless ride, destined to remain on the train as it traveled through an eternal loop, forever disconnected from the world he once knew. The boundaries between life and death had blurred, and there was no escape from the relentless, eternal journey of the train. Claire had always been a creature of routine, Every night after work, she would board the late bus home, settling into the same seat near the middle. She liked the quiet of the night rides. The bus, mostly empty, provided a welcome respite from the chaos of her day. The hum of the engine, the occasional squeak of the brakes, and the rhythmic passing of streetlights through the windows created a soothing rhythm. That was how it had always been, until the night she noticed the man sitting behind her. It wasn't unusual for other people to be on the bus, especially late at night, but something about this man's presence unsettled her. He hadn't been there when she first got on, and she hadn't seen him enter at any of the stops. His appearance was sudden, like he had simply materialized in the seat directly behind her. His breath was what drew her attention first, steady, a little too loud, almost deliberate. She glanced at the reflection in the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face, but it was too dark to make out any details. All she saw was the outline of a figure sitting too still. The next night, she found herself looking for him the moment she boarded. At first, the bus was empty, save for the driver and a couple of passengers seated up front. Claire felt a fleeting sense of relief, but as the bus rolled into the dimly lit streets, she heard it again, the heavy, rhythmic breathing. She stiffened. Somehow, without her noticing, the man had taken the seat just one row behind her again, even closer than the night before. She kept her eyes fixed forward, not daring to look back, even though she could feel his presence looming. The ride felt longer than usual, every second dragging on as the sensation of being watched grew stronger. When she finally reached her stop, Claire hurried off the bus without looking back. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just a tired mind playing tricks on her after long workdays. But the feeling lingered. The memory of that heavy breathing echoed in her mind long after she reached the safety of her apartment. The following night, as the bus rattled down the road, Claire couldn't shake the sense of dread that had built up over the past few days. She sat near the front this time, far from her usual spot, hoping to avoid the unsettling presence. But it didn't matter. Halfway through the journey, she heard it again, the breathing, slow and deliberate, as though someone was sitting right behind her. She couldn't understand how he kept finding her, why he always chose the seat closest to her no matter where she sat. Nervously, she glanced up at the driver in the mirror, wondering if anyone else had noticed the man, but the driver's eyes remained fixed on the road, oblivious. The other passengers, few as they were, seemed equally unaware. She felt a prickling sensation crawl up her spine, as if the world around her had grown distant, and she was the only one who could sense the disturbance. As the bus approached her stop, she stood up early, eager to escape. When the doors opened, Claire rushed off into the cool night air, her heart racing. But as the bus pulled away, she glanced back, just in time to see him. The man was standing at the rear window, his pale face pressed against the glass, watching her. His eyes, blank, emotionless, tracked her as the bus faded into the distance. For the first time, she saw his face clearly, and it was enough to send a shudder of fear through her. There was something disturbingly wrong about the way he looked, as though he didn't belong in the world she inhabited. That night, Claire found it impossible to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's face staring back at her from the window, his expression vacant, yet somehow filled with an intent she couldn't quite name. She tried to reason with herself, reminding herself that he was just a stranger, someone who had made her uneasy but posed no real threat. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't so simple. His presence wasn't normal, and the way he kept appearing, always right behind her, was more than just coincidence. The following nights, she avoided taking the bus altogether, opting instead for a longer walk home. But the feeling of being watched never left her. Even on the empty streets, she found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. Every reflection in a shop window, every passing car, made her heart race, her paranoia growing with each step. She couldn't shake the sensation that no matter where she went, the man would find her. One evening, exhausted from a week of sleepless nights and anxious walks, she reluctantly boarded the bus again, hoping the man had finally disappeared. The bus was emptier than usual, with only a few people scattered in the front rows. Claire chose a seat near the driver, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat tightly as the bus began its route. She tried to focus on the passing scenery, the blur of city lights, and the hum of the engine beneath her feet. But as they moved deeper into the city, the familiar, dreaded sound returned. The breathing, slow, deliberate, and much too close. Her heart sank. She didn't need to look to know that he was there, somewhere behind her, sitting in the shadows, watching. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, every muscle in her body tense, fighting the urge to turn around. But the urge grew stronger, gnawing at her until she couldn't resist any longer. She glanced over her shoulder just for a second, but the seat behind her was empty. For a moment, relief washed over her until she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. In the reflection of the bus's window, just behind her, she could see him, standing. His figure loomed large and still, his face obscured by the darkness, but his presence undeniable. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her pulse thundering in her ears. She forced herself to look forward again, her body frozen with terror. As the bus neared her stop, the man's reflection in the window grew closer. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing, moving toward her, his face just inches from her own. She felt a suffocating dread, knowing that the moment she stepped off the bus, he would follow. And no matter where she went, no matter how fast she ran, he would always be there, right behind her, waiting. Emily was drawn to the legend of the ghost line, a fabled route that only appeared to those destined to see it. Her fascination with trains led her to embark on a journey that promised an encounter with the supernatural. On this particular night, she boarded the train at the edge of the city, excited by the chance to witness the mythical path. The train itself was a relic, its exterior battered by time. Inside, it was lined with faded velvet seats and dim, flickering lights. Emily took a seat by the window, her anticipation mingling with the unease that had settled in her chest. The train started its journey, gradually leaving behind the city's glow and plunging into the darkness of the countryside. As they traveled, the landscape outside became increasingly obscure, swallowed by a dense fog that seemed to creep in from all directions. The train's engine roared softly, its rhythm lulling Emily into a sense of calm despite the encroaching mist. She glanced around at the other passengers, who were clad in old-fashioned attire, their eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. The train continued its course, and Emily felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The hum of the engine grew quieter, replaced by a strange stillness. The fog outside thickened, and the visibility dropped to mere inches. Trees loomed like ghostly sentinels, their forms blurred by the dense mist. The train's speed seemed to slacken, and the landscape outside became an indistinguishable expanse of white. When the train came to a halt, Emily peered through the window, but there was no station in sight. Instead, the world outside was enveloped in an oppressive gloom. The other passengers remained unmoved, their faces bathed in the dim, yellow light of the carriage. It felt as though time itself had stalled. The train began to move again, but something had changed. The motion was different, less predictable, more erratic. Emily's sense of disorientation grew. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the whispering wind outside seemed to carry voices, hushed and mournful. The train veered off the main tracks, plunging deeper into the fog. As the journey progressed, the fog seemed to tighten its grip, becoming almost tangible. The eerie silence inside the carriage was broken only by the occasional clatter of a loose fitting or the soft creak of the train's joints. Emily's heart pounded with mounting dread as the surroundings outside turned into an impenetrable shroud of white. Halfway through the journey, the passengers began to exhibit peculiar behavior. Their movements were slower, more deliberate. It was as if they were synchronized in their stillness. Emily's sense of unease intensified as she noticed their features becoming increasingly translucent, their forms blending with the dim light of the carriage. The train's lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers outside grew louder, but they remained just beyond the edge of comprehension. Emily's eyes darted around the carriage, trying to make sense of the growing sense of unease. The passengers' faces, once indistinguishable, now appeared as spectral visages, their eyes hollow and reflective. Realization began to dawn as Emily's gaze fell upon her own reflection in the window. Her features were fading, her skin growing translucent. Panic surged through her as she understood the gravity of her situation. The ghost line was not merely a legend. It was a realm that bridged the living and the dead. The train had become a vessel, transporting souls to the afterlife. Emily's panic mounted as she desperately searched for an escape. The train's lights dimmed further, casting an ominous glow. She attempted to leave her seat, but her legs felt weighted, almost as if they were being pulled down. The ghostly figures around her began to move closer, their presence palpable and unnerving. The train continued on, its path unchanging, as the fog outside enveloped everything in an impenetrable veil. Emily's world narrowed to the confines of the carriage, her attempts to escape thwarted by the spectral entities that now surrounded her. The realization hit her with full force. She was not just a passenger. She was part of a spectral journey, an endless cycle for those who were destined to travel the ghost line. As the train continued its relentless journey through the fog, Emily was trapped in the liminal space between life and death, her fate sealed within the shifting, ghostly expanse. The ghost line was not merely a passage through physical space, but a transition into an eternal voyage with no end, carrying the souls of the departed toward an unknowable destination. Lena had never believed in ghosts. The stories she heard growing up about haunted houses and restless spirits seemed like nothing more than tales meant to scare children. So when she moved into the old house on the outskirts of town, she dismissed the warnings from the locals. The house had been abandoned for years, its exterior weathered and overgrown, but Lena saw potential in it. A quiet place to start fresh, to carve out a space of her own. The first few days were filled with cleaning and fixing the little things, like the creaky floorboards and flickering lights, and she found comfort in the steady rhythm of restoring the place. But something began to shift. It started with small things, things she could explain away easily. At first, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible sound in the background of her days, like a distant murmur that ebbed and flowed, too quiet to make out clearly. It happened most often at night when the house was still and the wind whispered through the cracks. Lena told herself it was the house settling, the natural groans of an old structure adapting to a new occupant. She was used to the quirks of old buildings, and nothing seemed too unusual. But then, objects began to move. Small things at first. Her keys would be on a different table than where she'd left them, a chair slightly out of place, or a book lying open to a page she hadn't been reading. Lena chalked it up to her own forgetfulness, convinced that stress was getting to her. But the movements became harder to ignore. One night she found a window open that she was sure she'd closed, the wind whistling in through the curtains. Another day she walked into the kitchen to find all the drawers pulled open, their contents neatly arranged on the counter, as though someone had been searching for something. Despite these unsettling occurrences, Lena pressed on. She refused to let her imagination get the best of her. The house was hers, and she wasn't going to be scared off by a few odd moments. But as the days wore on, the strange events escalated. One evening, she came home from work to find the lights in the house flickering in unison, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. She stood at the doorway, watching as the lights blinked on and off in a rhythmic pattern, almost like they were trying to send her a message. The feeling of being watched came next. It was subtle at first, a vague awareness that crept up her spine when she walked through the house at night. It was as if there was a presence in the room with her, just beyond her line of sight. She began to catch herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching her from the darkened corners of the room. But every time she turned, there was nothing. Just the empty house and the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her more heavily each day. One night, as Lena lay in bed, something changed. The house was unusually quiet, the typical creaks and groans absent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Lena tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, and then she heard it, a distinct sound coming from the hallway outside her bedroom door. It was the unmistakable creak of floorboards underfoot, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was walking down the hall. Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened, frozen in place. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. They stopped just outside her door, and for a moment everything was silent again. Lena stared at the ceiling, her breath shallow, willing herself not to move. She waited, every muscle in her body tense, straining to hear any further sound, but nothing came. Just as she began to relax, there was a light tapping on the door. 3 soft, measured knocks that sent a chill racing down her spine. Lena sat up in bed, her heart hammering. The knocks came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of the doorknob slowly turning. But when she looked, the door didn't open. It simply rattled, as though something was trying to get in but couldn't. The next morning, Lena decided she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag, determined to leave and find somewhere else to live, even if only for a few days to clear her head. But as she gathered her things, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. Scratched into the wood of her bedroom door, right where the handle met the frame, were 3 long, deep marks, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way in during the night. The claw marks were fresh, the wood still raw and splintered. Lena's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She had locked the door the night before, and there was no sign of forced entry. The house was still and quiet around her, the morning sun filtering through the windows, casting the room in a warm, reassuring glow. But the marks were undeniable, a stark reminder that something had been in her house. Lena left the house that day, convinced that whatever was haunting the place wasn't just a figment of her imagination. She didn't know what it was, an angry spirit, a remnant of the house's dark history, or something far older and more sinister, but she knew one thing for sure. The house wasn't empty. Something was there, lurking just out of sight, watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And whatever it wasn't going to let her leave so easily. Even as she drove away, the house seemed to cling to her thoughts, its silent presence following her. The claw marks, the whispers, the tapping on the door, it was all connected, all part of something she couldn't understand, something that had been there long before she arrived. And no matter how far she went, the house's grip on her wouldn't let go. Jake boarded the midnight express with a sense of unease. The train, known for its late-night journeys between 2 isolated towns deep in the countryside, had a reputation for being old and rickety, yet dependable. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. The platform was nearly deserted, with only a few scattered souls waiting in the cold. As Jake stepped onto the train, the door groaned shut behind him, sealing him inside the dimly lit carriage. The interior was just as he had imagined, ancient. The wood-paneled walls were chipped and faded, and the seats sagged with age. A faint smell of dampness hung in the air. There were only a handful of passengers, most of whom sat silently, cloaked in heavy coats, their faces obscured by the shadows. Jake took a seat by the window and settled in for what he thought would be an uneventful ride. The train lurched forward with a creak, and soon they were cutting through the night. Outside, the world slipped by in a blur. Trees became dark smudges against the thickening fog, and the moonlight barely penetrated the mist that clung to the landscape. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing at first, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced around at the other passengers. None of them moved. They sat unnaturally still, staring blankly ahead. The air inside the carriage grew colder, and with each passing minute, an invisible weight seemed to press down on Jake's chest. After what felt like an hour, the train began to slow down. Jake leaned toward the window, squinting through the fog. A small, desolate station appeared in the distance, barely visible through the thick white haze. The station was unmarked. There was no name, no signage, nothing to indicate where they were. The platform was empty, not a single soul in sight. As the train came to a halt, an eerie silence fell over the carriage. Even the sound of the train's engine faded into the background, leaving only the oppressive stillness. Jake's discomfort grew. He checked his phone. No signal, of course. Outside, the station seemed frozen in time, as if it had been abandoned for years. No one got on or off the train. The passengers remained seated, motionless, their faces cast in shadow. Jake began to wonder if this stop was even on the schedule. His unease turned into dread when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. One of the passengers, a woman sitting several rows ahead, stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and unnatural. She turned around, her eyes catching the faint light from the flickering lamps overhead. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes weren't human. Her pupils glowed a dull, sickly yellow, like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. As she rose to her feet, the other passengers began to follow suit, one by one, standing in eerie unison. They all turned toward Jake, their faces illuminated now by the dim light, revealing eyes that shared the same unnatural glow. Jake's body tensed, his muscles frozen in place as the passengers moved toward him. Their steps were slow but purposeful, their faces devoid of emotion, like puppets under someone else's control. He tried to move, to stand up and run, but his legs felt as though they were made of lead. Panic surged through him as the realization struck. These weren't passengers at all. They were something else, something ancient and inhuman hiding in plain sight. The train began to move again, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it left the station. But Jake was no longer concerned about the journey. His mind raced with one desperate thought: escape. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling toward the back of the carriage, but the passengers, no, the creatures, were faster than he expected. They closed in around him, their cold, glowing eyes locking onto him with predatory intent. Jake reached the door leading to the next carriage and fumbled with the latch, his hands trembling. Behind him he could hear their footsteps, heavy and methodical, drawing closer with every passing second. He finally yanked the door open and darted into the next carriage, slamming it shut behind him. But the sound of the door slamming didn't offer the relief he hoped for. Instead, it echoed through the train like a death knell. The next carriage was eerily similar to the one he had just left. Old, worn seats, dim lights, the same pervasive feeling of decay. But something was different here. There were no passengers, no creatures, just the empty silence. Jake hurried down the aisle, his heart pounding in his chest, scanning for anything that might help him escape. He reached the end of the carriage and froze. There, lying on the floor, was a pile of old luggage, dusty, decayed, and covered in cobwebs. As Jake looked closer, a horrifying realization dawned on him. The luggage wasn't just abandoned. It belonged to the countless others who had boarded this train before him. Passengers who had never left. His breath caught in his throat. This train wasn't taking him to his destination. It was a trap, a vessel for something far darker. A scraping sound behind him sent a jolt of terror through his body. He turned, but it was too late. The creatures had followed him, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of hunger. The train picked up speed, hurtling forward into the unknown, but Jake knew now that it didn't matter where it went. The Midnight Express was not a mode of transport. It was a feeding ground, and Jake was its latest victim.